The next panel is going to kind of walk us through in detail what the exchange process would be. You all heard, the gold will start trading as 01F in June. So all the old golds can be exchanged, starting May 7th. So this panel is going to kind of walk us through the detailed process, and we'll take questions as to how the process itself will work. So with that, Barbara, can we have your team?
Okay, can you guys hear me? Okay. So we do have a long panel, and of course with Exchange, I'm Barbara Pak from Freddie Mac, and of course I could talk about Exchange for 4 hours, but we will not do that. We'll talk about it for about an hour and 15 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce this panel. So with me, we have Brandon Devers from Tradeweb, and we're actually going to show a little demo of what Tradeweb is going to be doing as if you want to go through an exchange directly to Freddie Mac. Okay, we also have Greg McDonald from Citi, and operationally we have been talking a lot around how exchange will work, but we will talk a little bit about strategy and what we're hearing from a color perspective from an investors. And then Joran from BlackRock, he is also talking about from an investor perspective. Okay, and we also have Frank with us from CS. Again, we've been working on it for several years now. You know that we have a dealer facilitated path around how exchange will work, so he will spend some time talking about how that's going to work. And we also have Chris from JP Morgan. As you know, we've been also working with the custodian community of how this impacts custodians, so he will touch on that a bit. Okay, before we start, we have a little treat, so if you could cue it up.
In June 2019, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae TBA-eligible securities will merge into a single TBA market. At that time, Freddie Mac Gold PCs will no longer be issued, so what will happen to your PC holdings? Beginning in May, Freddie Mac will offer an optional exchange process to convert securities with a 45-day payment delay into the new 55-day format. The process will be free and set up for same-day settlement. While a few security identifiers and the payment date will change, the 55-day security will be backed by the same underlying loans as the 45-day. You'll also receive a one-time float compensation payment to adjust for the longer payment delay. The exchange itself will not be taxable and can be treated as a minor modification. For tax treatment of the float compensation, you should consult a tax professional. Should you decide to exchange, there will be two different paths you can follow. For a direct to Freddie Mac exchange via Tradeweb, submit the exchange to Tradeweb either through your order management system or directly on Tradeweb. You'll receive your 55-day securities and float compensation through two separate wires. You might prefer this path if you want free delivery and a separate cash wire payment for accounting purposes. Another option is the dealer facilitated exchange. Here, your dealer will book the trade and work directly with Freddie Mac to complete the required transactions on your behalf. You might prefer the dealer path if you don't have complex sub-accounts to navigate, or if you want DVP settlement. Single security will be here soon. Now is the time to start thinking about how you'll handle the exchange process. As you prepare, be sure to talk to your custodians, OMS providers, and dealers or Tradeweb about your plans. A good first step is to use these tools to evaluate your exchange-related options. And for the latest information and updates, visit the Freddie Mac and Tradeweb exchange websites. If you have any questions, just reach out. We're always here to help.
All right. All right, so I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the exchange overview. And for a lot of folks, this should be very, very familiar. And there's a lot of information here. So we will go ahead and send out the materials on our website. So all the actual materials for this conference should be posted in the website. So talking about exchange, and this is Freddie only. So if you hold any of the Fannie MBS today, don't need to do any exchange. But Freddie PCs or Giants, you do need to go through an exchange. What we're going to do is we're going to actually open up the exchange May 7th. So that is the date that the actual exchange will be opening up the dealer path as well as the Tradeweb path. The first settle of that exchange will happen on May 17th. So again, we're trying to start that before June 3rd to make sure that people have enough supplies of UMBS if you wanted to deliver into the TBA. Okay? So I think you probably also have heard this notion of mirror security. So again, we want to operationally be very efficient in getting the security out to you guys on UMBS. So there are about 70,000 securities that we have actually mirrored. So it will be TBAs and also non-TBAs that we have mirrored. And we will continue to mirror those securities, the 45, into the UMBS until we go live. Okay? And we will talk a little bit about the two exchange path, which is the dealer facilitated path that we've been working on for at least 4 to 5 years, and the Tradeweb path that we announced last summer. Okay? The other thing is, just so that everybody's clear, when you do these exchange, it's exactly the same 45 days. The cash flows are exactly the same. All you're doing is just getting a wrap with a payment delay of 55 days. And so because we're changing the payment delay to match Fannie's MBS, you will be compensated for that 10 days of delay. Okay? And we have started to publish the float grid on a weekly basis. And actually, I do have an example later on. Okay? There are several resources out there that try to get information out there. We have a lot of presentations, but to be very concise, we listed out the preliminary exchange offering document. So that's actually a good document. There is an exhibit in the exhibit hall. We have a little table for Dealer Direct. So if you want to see the demo of how Dealer Direct will work, and we also have some copies of the offer announcement, so if you want to get a copy. Okay? Let me move on to the next page. This is two path. So again, we're trying to provide a couple of options for investors that are holding gold PCs and Giants today. Dealer facilitated path, which is going to be open for a foreseeable future. That most likely will be DBP, and we'll have Greg and Frank talk a little bit about what that looks like. There are about 33 dealers that are signed up currently to facilitate this exchange. We have direct to Freddie Mac via Tradeweb. I think we are hearing about 100 or so investors that have initiated onboarding for that path. Okay? Okay, there will be some also new disclosures that's going to be available. So we wanted to be very transparent around what is actually available for 45, what's come in to us. So there will be a daily exchange disclosures that we will be publishing, as well as cumulative, so you know what portion of those CUSIPs that move from 45 to 55. We also want to make sure that you are also looking at the level 1 collateral, because you could actually exchange whole Giants. You can't ignore Giants. And so that's really the reason we're going to try to break it down to the lowest collateral. And so we will also provide that on a daily basis. On a monthly basis, we're also providing what we're calling this outstanding supply report to make sure that everybody understands what's available for trading for 45, and that has moved to the 55-day UMBS. Okay. I think Mike touched on it this morning about the float compensation. Again, because we are matching the payment delay to 55, you're giving up that 10 days of float. So Freddie Mac is calculating a fair value to compensate for that. And there are a lot of literature around this transaction. So we did go to both SEC and IRS to see if those transactions, the exchange transaction, should recognize any gains or losses or tax purposes. They both came back and says we do not need to recognize any gains and losses, or from IRS perspective, the base transaction is not a taxable event. But they were silent around the float compensation. So we did, from a Freddie perspective, went out and said we are treating it as a tax-free adjustment. But again, we are advising all our investors to talk with your tax lawyers and tax advisors. Okay. This is the float compensation. This is one of the tools that's out there, and we're publishing this on a weekly basis now. And what we're going to do is, starting in probably end of March, beginning of April, this will be a daily publication that will go out on our website, as well as is going to be in our Dealer Direct. Okay. Okay, this is another tool to just make it easier for investors that has, our securities that could look at, they could load up the actual CUSIP and you could get the calculation of that float comp. So this tool is already out there on our website. Okay, let me turn it over to Brian to talk about the Tradeweb path.
Thank you, Barbara. Since we've been engaged with Freddie since early this summer, we've had numerous meetings with all different types of investors. And what I'm going to try and do is kind of boil things down into the most common themes that we've received from all of the investors that we've seen. Basically, it boils down into 3 points. Number one, how do I enter exchanges into Tradeweb? The options, we wanted to make sure that we supported as many varieties as we possibly could. We wanted to make sure that the existing workflows that clients have, we could continue to support. And so we're going to allow people to manually enter the exchanges into our system. You'll be able to cut and paste from Excel, or of course we'll support from your OMS fixed messaging. And we can do a whole deep dive in fixed messaging at a later point. I will not bore you with all the fixed details with that. The next key component is that exchanges, as everyone should be aware of by now, are done at an allocation or sub-account level. So that means what kind of options do you have in order to get the exchanges in? We will support, from a workflow point of view, either a pre-allocated methodology or a post-allocated. In the pre-allocated workflow, which we do encourage, it's less moving parts, it's more streamlined. You'll be loading up your sub-accounts and your allocations prior to sending the transaction to Freddie. And obviously in the post-allocation world, you're going to basically send a block to Tradeweb. Couple important things here. Because Freddie has the capacity issues of around 50,000 transactions a day, we need to tell Freddie what you're going to be allocating eventually. And so when you pre-allocate, we know up front you're doing 100 allocations for a given CUSIP. In the post-allocation flow, we have to tell Freddie to reserve 100 spots so that they know how much capacity they have to withhold for other participants. The last piece is post-trade. Once you do your exchange, where are you going to find the information that you need to communicate to your downstream systems? Float comp and exchange IDs will all be available in 3 different ways. The first is a flat file. It's a file that we've used by many of our clients for years, and we will write to a local drive, and we will add for each allocation, we will show you what that float comp and exchange ID is. You'll be able to go in and pull that out and process that through your system. We're also going to have a report, and I'll give you a quick preview of that, that will be a little bit more consolidated and show you the exchange and float ID, and that report can be emailed to you immediately following each exchange. And then lastly, if you are integrated with us and you are taking back our fixed allocation message, we will include the float comp and exchange ID in those fixed tags as well. Couple things just about the allocations I failed to mention is that we need to have your settlement instructions onboarded onto our system so that we can communicate them to Freddie. We will support either a manual entry of that into our AccountNet database, or we have integration with Alert where we can pull down your settlement instructions and integrate them into our system. And again, when you contact us at Tradeweb, we'll help you facilitate all that as part of the onboarding. So in the pre-allocated flow, I'm just going to give you a very quick example of what people need to show or to include on their exchanges if you're manually entering. In the top grid there, this is an example of a single CUSIP that'll be spread out across 3 accounts. We need very little information, just the CUSIP itself, your original face, and then the sub-accounts. Optionally, you can give us your desired settlement date, and I'll show you that in a minute. Or you can also give us a price. The price is not involved in the exchange in any way. It's merely to help our customers facilitate the processing. Most systems will require a price to be put through whatever trading system or order management system. If you give us a price, we'll echo that price back to you in all the various reports that I mentioned, as well as the fixed feeds. If you do not give us a price, we're just going to tag this thing at par and send that downstream. It's so that your systems don't choke on not having having an empty field in, empty value in those fields. The next grid below it is a post-allocated example. And again, I mentioned the difference between these two rows is very simple. In the first column, I'm showing the number of allocations that I would have to tell Freddie that I'm going to eventually allocate. Again, a exchange does not actually get consummated until there are allocations sent to Freddie. That's a really important point, which is why we like the pre-allocated, so it gets done in one fell swoop. Very hard to read, but the flat file, again, these are just two examples of the information that we will send down. I think the bottom one is the email report that I mentioned, where we will show you the individual accounts, the 45-day QSIP, the 55-day QSIP, the exchange ID, and the float comp for each individual allocation. And these can be blown up a little bit more later. I think we're going to go through and show a little video. In the example video I'm going to show you, we're just going to do one QSIP, but we can handle multiple line items at a time, and I think we can start it now. So here's an example of a single QSIP being split among 9 different accounts for a total original face of, I think I have 9 million in there. First column is going to be the direction. Obviously, you're selling the 45-day securities. The next column is going to be the QSIP, original face, and then again, I can also include the price in here. Very simple. All you need to do is highlight the array, copy it, and then I'm going to bring up the exchange screen in a second. So about the exchange screen. First time you bring up every time you bring up the exchange screen, you're going to be brought to this splash screen where you can have access to some of the legal docs from Freddie, and you'll have to acknowledge this to it's basically a link to the offering circular. And now from here, you simply click the paste button, and the contents will load up. Now, if you remember, we had nine allocations. Those allocations will be rolled up into the block level that you're seeing on the screen right now. So there's 9 million current face, or sorry, original face. And then when I click on this breakdown button, it'll show you the splits broken out accordingly as to what you saw in the spreadsheet. So we would do this for every single QSIP and every allocation and roll it up onto the screen. As soon as you load this in, you can see that we are pulling in the capacity calendar on the left-hand side. That will show you all of the dates and the available capacity at the time you brought up the screen. Next, you're going to choose a settlement date. Can you just hold it 1 second for me before we send it off? As soon as you load your QSIPs into this screen, we are going out to Freddie and giving you the float comp that Barbara mentioned earlier. We're pinging them, and over to the right-hand side is the float comp in the last column. And I can't remember what the number is here, but it's highlighted in yellow. So now, once you tee everything up and you hit the send button, you'll proceed to what we call our negotiation screen. And it's a little bit misleading in this case because there's no negotiation. Freddie is coming back to you saying that they have the capacity and here's the float compensation for every line item that you put in the list. Like all of our screens, you simply have to accept it, and then you'll get notification at this point that the trade has been confirmed. Now, if you have a pre-allocated scenario, at this point, we've sent the information, the settlement instructions to Freddie. If you have a post-allocated scenario, can you stop for 1 second? In a post-allocated scenario, you will still have to go back before close of business that day and do your allocations and send them through. In a pre-allocated scenario, that's already done here. This last example, again, is a little bit blown up version of the emailed report. You can go ahead. And you can see the splits that have been broken out. Each row indicates an exchange. Each item has their own exchange ID and float comp. And then the last one is just an example of what that STP flat file that I mentioned. Again, the highlighted rows in yellow are the individual splits that I talked about. The rest are all just blocks that get canceled. Again, this file is written to across all the trades that happen on throughout the day on Tradeweb. Last thing I'll just mention, again, we opened up onboarding last month. We've had great interest, and if you haven't gotten your onboarding package, I just encourage you to contact UMBS@tradeweb.com or your sales rep. That's it.
Okay, Greg?
Sure. Excuse me. So I'd say largely a lot of the conversations we're having with clients surround, should I or shouldn't I exchange? And generally those conversations, involve kind of gapping the difference between, working directly with Tradeweb or exchanging through a dealer. I'd say that, largely the difference, or also then gapping between, if we were doing a Giant today, what's different with respect to UMBS Exchange. So some of the questions that generally come up are, can I negotiate the float comp? No. Can I run trades at a pre-specified price? The answer to that is generally no. I think our intention is that we'll buy the 45-day at the generic, would be the UMBS TBA price plus the float comp, and process the exchange with Freddie and deliver back the UMBS at the generic TBA price for that respective coupon. And really the rationale for that is, dealers have to manage their intraday liquidity at their clearing banks. So that in conjunction with intraday credit risk, we want to have a reasonable proxy for the securities leaving the investor's firm, entering our firm, to manage that intraday credit risk. It's not perfect, but the other aspect of that accomplishes is that we're not running what would be perceived to be off-market trades. So a lot of conversations we have with investors are, essentially just weighing the pros and cons of going through Tradeweb versus going through dealers. Another benefit I'd say of Tradeweb versus a dealer is that if you exchange through Tradeweb, you're maintaining the anonymity of your portfolio, right? So obviously if you're exchanging with a dealer, you're showing the dealer what you're holding, the size that you're holding. So another common discussion point is just, what's the flow of information, who do I call, and then what's the process? So largely, we're telling clients that you go through your normal sales coverage. The difference with a normal trade is that you're over communicating, or you're communicating more with an exchange transaction that you would be with a normal trade that you may do on a block level. So in terms of the fields that we would need to facilitate an exchange, pool ID or QSIP, if you give us one, we can back into the other. The size of the orig face of the 45-day that you hold at a sub-account level. Now, as and Yaron and I have had many discussions about this. Some clients may want to keep the names or the accounts of who's holding the individual golds for their sub-accounts anonymous to their sales coverage or the respective trading desks at that dealer. We're really indifferent. We can take that information up front, so similar to what a pre-allocation style exchange would be, or at a minimum, we just need to know the size on a rich face basis, because that's how we're pre-scheduling with Freddie Mac. At that point, we'll look to dealer direct. We'll ensure that there's adequate capacity to facilitate the exchange. We'll confirm the float comp. We'll level the trades, and generally that'll be at that, as I mentioned, the generic UMBS price, plus the float comp. Agree on the level, and the exchange is set for that day. I believe generally, right, where initially the time between exchange and settlement initially will be T+2.
Yep.
And I believe as many days out as 30 days.
You could
initially?
actually book, 2 months.
2 months, okay. So, generally we'll be accommodating, that full time frame. Other questions really revolve around what, should I exchange? What are the benefits of exchanging versus not exchanging? I'd say generally we've been telling people that if you intend on delivering UMBS into TBA, that's essentially your use case for exchanging. If you're not intending on delivering the UMBS into TBA, if the respective bonds are trading, spec, then there's very little compelling reason, to exchange unless you feel that the fair value of the float comp, that the float comp is in excess of the fair value. So, we don't necessarily see a compelling reason to exchange unless, investors are planning on delivering into a TBA. And then another path for exchange certainly is, if you have generic collateral and you want to move up the coupon stack or down the coupon stack, then we can bid those bonds in the normal course of business. So that would be essentially certainly an easier way to exchange from an operational perspective.
Okay.
I'd say that's
Great.
pretty much it.
Thanks, Greg. So you're on from BlackRock, and you're kind of proxy for investor community. To the extent that you're comfortable sharing, just on readiness and how you guys feel about the exchange timing and what you are doing to get ready.
Sure. Thanks, Barbara. So first of all, thanks, Barbara, and thanks to the GSEs for putting this panel together. I do recall about a year and a half or 2 years ago when we started these conversations, the 4 or 5 different paths that we're talking about, the numerous questions, and we feel like we've reached now a stage where, at least from a BlackRock perspective and investor perspective, we feel confident going to the exchange as far as what's required and how to transact with either Freddie or the broker dealers. I think part of this is, you guys, Freddie Mac, as well as SIFMA, being very engaging, not just with the investor community, but also with custodians, broker dealers, and other stakeholders. So from an investor perspective, what are some of the things that we did, at least from BlackRock's point of view? One thing that we sort of did from the get-go is sort of educational exercise with the various teams within BlackRock, starting with the PM teams, sort of giving them a heads up on what the exchange entails, the various paths that are open to the exchange, but also engaging with our operational teams as well as fund accounting and technology to really nail down some of those details when it comes to direct to Freddie path as well as the broker-dealer path. And as everyone has mentioned, there's essentially 2 paths now, the direct to Freddie path and dealer path. What are some of the key differences between the 2 paths, right? One is, we talked about, the direct to Freddie path is free delivery, whereas the dealer path is delivery versus payment. Another difference is the counterparty. Direct to Freddie, you only have one counterparty, Freddie Mac, whereas the broker-dealer path, you have various counterparties. Now, one thing that investors have to be aware of is the fact that when it comes to Freddie Mac, they have to do some due diligence as far as understanding if there is any really prohibitions against trading with Freddie Mac as a counterparty. That's highly unlikely from our perspective, but that's something that each investor has to think about. So what we've done, at least from a BlackRock perspective, is first of all, look at the direct to Freddie path and look at Freddie as a counterparty. What restrictions are there in our systems, in our guidelines against Freddie as a counterparty? As I mentioned, very little so far, but also what investors have to think about is also what we call implicit restrictions, where you can have certain clients that might require you to trade with only a certain group of broker dealers, which by default then exclude Freddie. So that's something, again, that investors have to keep in mind as they're setting up Freddie Mac as a counterparty in their systems. Another aspect that we've been heavily involved with, not just internally with our fund accounting as well as technology teams, is the whole questions the question about the market price versus book price. And thankfully, this is where the custodian community, I'd say, came to the rescue, where they had this sort of recommendation that came out of a SIFMA committee, whereas as long as an investor passes on to the custodians the exchange ID that links up the cash compensation with the exchange rates, they'll be able to do the necessary tax and accounting treatment on their end. And this is important because, as we said, the exchange is non-taxable, and the SEC has also come out with their suggestion or recommendation that this is a minor modification. And this is very important, especially for book yield sensitive accounts, if they're planning on exchanging the Freddie 45 Gold PCs. Another piece that we've been talking, at least from an investor perspective, is that we're talking about is SWIFT enhancements with the custodians. And so we took the general recommendation coming out of the SIFMA committee, or the SIFMA custodian committee, and we plan to include that exchange ID on the SWIFT to facilitate the proper accounting treatment. So good progress on that end, and we should have that ready before the exchange commences. Another important piece that we sort of have engaged from BlackRock perspective, at least from an investor perspective, is trying to understand how we're going to go about the exchanges, right? Talking to the various PM teams within BlackRock that are potentially interested in exchanging, how they're going to approach the exchanges. And obviously, at least the initial input has been that we'd want to start slowly testing out the waters, making sure that the exchange mechanism is working properly. And then depending on market dynamics, it'll be up to each individual PM to sort of make a decision as to whether they want to exchange or not. But even before getting to that May 7th critical date, I think what we're going to do as BlackRock at some point, probably next few weeks, reach out to a few custodians, as well as probably working in partnership with Tradeweb to put in some sort of test exchange trades to make sure that the pipes are working correctly. The last piece that I want to talk about real quick is the exchange calculator. So we've been going online quite a bit on the Freddie website to test out the exchange calculator, and it's a great tool. I really think so. It's a very easy to use, simple calculator tool, XLS based, does not need a guide. You can just go in, put in a CUSIP number, a pool number, and the original par or par amount, and it'll spit out the compensation payment. And we've been very happy with it so far. So I think
Great.
that's about it from my perspective.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ron. So you're on the, are you leaning toward direct to Freddie Mac using Tradeweb, or are you building, capability for both?
I'll just say that we're keeping both options open.
Okay, that's great. All right, Frank, so from CS perspective, what are you guys doing to get ready to support the market on the exchange?
Sure, thank you. So we have been working with the industry to work through the process of exchanging golds for the UMBS. First of all, I'm happy to report, as Nick Bada at early committee reported, that the ability to clear the TBA is something that we've tested with the FSCC, and we find it to be sufficient, certainly for this purpose. So that is a good step. Important that not just we're talking about conversions, but the ability to trade the product is also able to be executed in the marketplace. We've also tested with Freddie Mac, right, the dealer direct path. Those exchanges in a file structure is easily be able to support not just our activity, but our client activity. So those two mechanisms are absolutely critical to getting our exchanges and trading executed in the marketplace. In terms of our client base, we're certainly reaching out to our client base to talk through the two options about what they're thinking about, and we're trying to work through with them, because each client's a little different. Some of the client bases have a lot of mutual funds, a lot of investors. Others are more single account structures. And there is complexity in that process. So we have to talk to each client almost on a one individual basis to see where they are And without giving them hard recommendations, right, we're giving them approaches to solve their business problem. As Greg indicated, there are pros and cons to each approach. I agree with almost everything he said in terms of what the requirements are. I do think, though, one thing, and just to clarify, in order to be a dealer path submission, we are going to need the data at the sub-account level with the clear identifier of who the sub-account is, because we have to deliver the assets back to that sub-account. So it can't be anonymous. We need to actually be able to receive the assets from that sub-account and deliver the assets back to that sub-account. And often the sub-account level clients have different custodian banks. So we need to know exactly who the counterparty is, just as a point of clarification. But getting that information up front allows us to be able to give it to Freddie Mac in the expected delivery components. So we need to forecast that size, the counterparty, and the pools to each transaction in order to effectuate that delivery on behalf of the client. So that's sort of prerequisite. You can give us the information later, but then we would have to rebook the entire structure. So we are going to expect our clients to give us the counterparties, the pools, and the actual original phases of each delivery at the delivery level that we're expecting from the custodian so that we can turn it on to Freddie Mac. In terms of the rationale why one's better than the other, again, it really depends on the type of counterparty you're dealing with. But one thing I would like to emphasize is, some clients will have concerns about releasing their entire portfolio. We're completely on board with that. We definitely do not want to see, data that somebody would be uncomfortable with. So that's one reason why we helped Freddie Mac and Tradeweb try to keep this approach where it's really more centric that the client is dealing with the issuer on a sort of relative basis to each other. In this case, that satisfies a lot of the concerns that a portfolio manager might have about releasing his entire inventory to a dealer. And there's other ways to deal with it in terms of splitting the portfolio into multiple dealers. In theory, that works out fine, but then you get into more operational complexity about the transfer, doing it multiple times with multiple people, multiple times. So it's there are some pros and cons here. But some of the other elements, if you are a customer with mutual funds or 40 Act funds, because these transactions are not trades, these conversions are, it's a settlement process, but it is not a trade. Some custodians, we believe, have difficulty releasing the assets of a 40 Act fund or a mutual fund into those types of transactions because we're not an issuer, we're a broker-dealer. So you have to sort of go through that path to make sure that the assets of your client, your ultimate client, is that eligible to be delivered into a transaction that we're executing here, which is a conversion. In many cases, we understand that that's not that simple to overcome, and therefore, Tradeweb path might be more advantageous for those types of clients. Now, we understand certainly most of our clients have a mixed usage of accounts. There isn't a single, across the board answer for every client. But again, if you have to make a choice, do you want to have two different processes for two different types of clients? Many of our clients, are evaluating that, and that's ultimately what they need to make a decision on. So those are important issues. The other thing about DVP, some people are asking us, well, why do I need to do a DVP transaction? And why can't I pick the prices that I want with the dealer? Our answer is sort of twofold. One is it has to be DVP. We cannot do a free payment because we're not going to put our client at risk by having intraday exposure to a broker-dealer where they give us billions of assets for free, and then we'll give them return those assets sometime later on in the day. We're just not willing to expose our clients to that type of risk, not in that magnitude anyway. So it's, it has to be a DVP transaction. And then when you get to the question as to what type of DVP transaction is going to be, why is it market? Why can't I use my price? Is this going to cause me some tax event? Like, we're cognizant of that concern, but again, we are trying to reduce the amount of operational risk in this process. We can be talking about billions of securities, hundreds of pools being exchanged, over 50 or 60 funds. We're trying to reduce the amount of element of operational risk, and we cannot really support unique prices that we would have to individually record on our trades. It's we are typically set up to be a TBA shop where the same price is on every single sub-account executed at the same time. So I understand it might cause concerns or make the Tradeweb path a little more feasible for those types of outcomes, but we're trying to look at the bigger risk here, and the bigger risk from our perspective is intraday credit risk and operational risk. And we're trying to reduce both those elements. That does not make for a perfect solution, but it does explain why we're getting into where we are. Similar to Greg, I think we're seeing a lot of people with open interest. We're not, and you're on, sorry, excuse me. We're not hearing 100% one way or the other. There is a fair amount of optionality. But I do see that eventually some of these root causes come home to roost. It will have to be a clear choice. I would expect most clients want to do it one way or the other. I don't see both approaches being done on a large scale basis with any one client.
Okay, great, Frank. So,
Yeah, no,
Good.
just to clarify, in terms of anonymity, just to clarify my point,
Sure.
I think we've set up a process where you can bifurcate the information you're communicating to the front office versus what you would communicate in the normal course of business from a post-trade feed perspective. So, we would essentially re-aggregate. If you've got five sub-accounts in a single pool, you can give us the sizes of those 5 sub-accounts, but not the sub-accounts at the inception of the exchange. And then we would roll those back up to a block, and we can, allocate those in the normal course of business, whether use, an Omgeo product or, direct fixed messaging. Just to clarify, that was the
Thanks, that makes sense.
intention there.
okay. So actually, Frank, we're providing great service to the investor clientele. To the extent that you could answer this, are you going to be charging for the service?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Can you
Are you going to charge for the service?
Oh, charge. There are costs here. So I don't think I can speak for the entire broker-dealer community, but what I can do is elaborate what the cost, for this process is. Because we're charging DVP transactions to the client base, we're essentially paying for these assets as the day opens up at the Fed. However, our exchange with Freddie Mac is done free because that has been their historical way. They execute Giants, Megas, and Remic. So the exchange of collateral from the dealer to Freddie Mac is free of payment. So we have an imbalance, right? And we are looking at that imbalance pretty closely with our treasury teams. So a client with a $5 billion portfolio delivers that at 9 o'clock. We may deliver it to Freddie Mac at 9:05. They've given us every assurance they'll turn around as quickly as possible, but in their stated, it's going to take, the worst case scenario, about an hour to turn around that collateral. So in between that time period, between where we receive the collateral and we get it back from Freddie Mac, we're running intraday risk, daylight overdraft risk with the bank. So we're paying for bonds. We're not getting paid when we deliver the bonds out. That spread may take an hour to process. We need to evaluate that as how expensive that is, and how much, because how much can we support? A $5 billion portfolio isn't very large in the $3 trillion dollar trade pool market, but it's fairly large to a broker dealer running a unsecured credit risk, or daylight overdraft risk at the Fed. So we need to watch that, and then make each firm's going to have to make an individual decision about how it treats that risk back to the ultimate client, risk/cost. So we don't have unlimited balance sheet, and we don't have unlimited amount of cash to support this intraday usage of daylight overdraft. So I would expect every dealer will have to come up with his own answer for that question. Obviously, there's other things like DPP charges on settlements that each bank has to work with. Those are other elements that with of course, the operational infrastructure just to support the exchange itself. So I don't think we have a hard answer as to whether we are going to charge. We're going to look at those elements though, and make a business decision.
Okay. Greg, could I ask?
Yeah, I mean, we're not planning on charging anything, initially. I think, we're looking at it as an accommodation to our clients. That being said, I think we're going to need to evaluate over time, capacity constraints. But I think our initial view is that it's essentially an accommodation we're making for clients.
Okay.
Barbara, I should clarify, in terms of the flow fee, there would be no charge on the flow fee. The flow fee will be a wash, as your projection called for. It will be embedded in our model, embedded in the trade price. So you'll see that as a transparent charge credit to the client.
Yeah. So I don't know. So FINRA has provided guidance and said essentially this exchange transaction is not a reportable transaction, and to the extent that there is no additional charge other than the flow comp passing through, they really saw this as it's not a normal trade, so it's not reportable. I think Fed is also going to be coming up with the guidance that this is not a reportable event. Okay. So let me turn over to Chris. So Chris, from a custodian perspective, I know you've been working with us for several years now to getting ready. So types of things that you're doing to get ready to support exchange, as well as if there's a wish list from investors as they provide instructions to you to getting this exchange happen.
One of the things that was clear to us very early on in the initiative is we were going to need to exercise all paths to educate both our internal teams as well as our client base. One of the things that's unique about being a custodian, we have no visibility to intent. We have no visibility to a trigger that may encourage a portfolio manager to exchange the securities. And we also realized very early on we had no metrics around which path our clients would potentially choose. So one of the things that we did very early on in the effort is we started to poll our clients and ask questions around, if you haven't done so yet, ask your portfolio managers what the triggers to exchange may be. Also, could you give us some insight on whether you're going to leverage the TradeWeb or the broker-dealer path? And a couple of interesting things that came out of those discussions. We saw a pretty healthy percentage of clients that are going to leverage each path. So we knew that as a custodian we would need to support both. The other thing that we realized is every asset owner had a different strategy, and sometimes that was based on their relationship with an investment manager. So we've also asked our clients if they haven't had an in-depth conversation with their investment manager to do so, and to get an understanding of what the intent of that investment manager is. We've had some say to us, we're not going to exchange at all, and we've had others say to us, we're going to exchange the entire inventory and we're going to start day one. So we were never concerned about volume, because custodians are built to handle volume. And one of the unique things about this happening early in 2019 is we all went through capacity testing around the shortened settlement cycle in the US market last year. It's DTC eligible securities, which was different, but we had no concerns around, and we still don't have any concerns around processing volume. But what I would say is we're encouraging all of our clients, whether you leverage a third-party investment manager or not, to initiate the exchange request early. If you're leveraging Tradeweb, fine. Initiate the request to Barbara's point. You can initiate up to 2 months in advance. Get that reference number, so then you know you have a slot on that targeted settlement day. Same holds true if you're working with a broker-dealer. We ask our clients to, to reach out to that broker-dealer and ensure they're comfortable with how to initiate an exchange transaction. The other thing that was touched on by a couple of my colleagues on the panel is we need the SWIFT messages to be tagged properly when they come into the custodian. We have to make sure for the broker-dealer path, leveraging RVPs and DVPs, that we don't show any realized gain or loss on the transaction. We also have to make sure the tax lots are handled properly. And that's a big concern for our fund accounting clients. But not only JP Morgan fund accounting clients, but third parties that could be supporting accounting on a portfolio. So, Barbara, to your question, the biggest the biggest part of the effort for us has been education. And that's why we appreciate working with Freddie over the last couple of years to get the information out, encourage active industry engagement, and for hosting events like this.
Okay, great. So I know that you've been kind of informally surveying your clients, so actually we do have a polling question just in the same line to say, so why don't we queue up one of the polling questions, so if you could get your tools ready. We do want to see how everybody's going to vote. So, of course I can read it. What is your preference? Brian, can you read that?
What is your preferred method to exchange? Through an authorized dealer, directly with Freddie Mac via Tradeweb? I'm preparing to use both paths. I don't know yet. I do not plan to exchange.
All right.
Barely be.
All right, let's see the results. Tradeweb, what is that, 40%?
40.2.
40, okay, so we got a bill for both paths, Chris, but it looks like there's a lot more folks from Tradeweb perspective.
Barbara,
Yes.
sorry, just one bit of information to add. When investors are thinking about the direct to Freddie path versus the dealer path, I can think of a couple of scenarios where an investor might have to go the dealer path as opposed to the direct to Freddie. One of them being the one I mentioned earlier, where there's a restriction against having Freddie as a counterparty. As I said, highly unlikely, but it's possible. And another scenario is where you have these 40 Act mutual funds that Frank was referring to earlier that might be more comfortable doing a DVP trade for the exchange as opposed to a free of payment. So if that's the case, then you might have to pursue the dealer path.
I think with that too.
If I could just add to that. Also, certain investment managers have said to us, they're subject to the sensitivities around the custody rule. So they don't want to send us a free instruction. So that may lead certain clients that are being supported by a third-party investment manager who isn't willing to send that free of payment instruction to travel down the broker-dealer path.
Yeah, I think the qualifying question there is, does it change the path if you're dealing or you're thinking about Freddie as an issuer as opposed to a counterparty? So I think if you can get comfortable with that
Yep.
concept, that really is the qualifying question if you need to make that decision.
Yeah, and so because of that, we did go to an outside counsel to get a sort of an independent assessment of how you guys, the 40 Act funds, get comfortable delivering to us for free. So that literature is out there on our website as well.
Which I think was very useful, by the way.
Okay. So Brian, so that it looks like Tradeweb is going to be maybe the leading path. So timing of onboarding. So you said about 100 folks are already initiating onboarding. How long is that going to take to onboard that beginning to end?
So from the time we get an inbound inquiry, we can turn around the legal docs within about an hour or two and get that back out to you. Once those docs, it's 2 forms for existing customers. One is the Freddie Investor Exchange Agreement. The other form is a Tradeweb, essentially an addendum. On that form, we ask for a little bit of information regarding how you want us to get your settlement instructions, a couple of points of contact, and then since we're getting a little bit more involved in settlement here, we ask for a settlement contact for Freddie's operational folks. Once that's in-house and you upload your tax document to our portal, we begin our KYC process. That takes, we're buffering 2 to 3 weeks to turn that around, and then we hand it off to you guys for the final decision. So, end to end, it's roughly around 3 weeks.
Okay. So yeah, it's just giving everybody a heads up. If Tradeweb is the path that you want to choose, then you take time to get that started as soon as possible. The window's open right now, but it does take about 2 to 3 weeks to finish that process. So along with the actual package of getting everything done, there is an investor agreement that Freddie is attaching to this onboarding. And so we are also getting some feedback on the investment agreement. So we are working with various investors as well as SIFMA to get the consolidated feedback. So I think we are in the process of maybe changing or making the investment agreement a little better. So that should be coming out shortly. All right, so Greg, so we have been publishing the float comp grid on a weekly basis. Any reaction to what we've been publishing so far?
Yeah, I think we've been encouraged. We've been looking at it ourselves, and we've been encouraging clients that have inquired about exchange. What the sufficiency of the float comp is. And I'd say that there's varying views. I think the natural reaction is always that it's not enough versus fair value, but what else would an investor say? So yeah, but I think we're being and largely our clients are being as considerate around really evaluating it. I think that potentially certainly we were not looking at that as closely initially. More focused on the mechanics of exchange, and that's something that we and I know that our client base is certainly looking at a lot more closely now. But I think the economics can change right up, obviously, until we get into the exchange window. So it's something we're tracking. I think we agree in principle with the methodology of using the flat OAS. But that's largely where we're at.
Okay, great. So Frank, so we do have a capacity that we're trying to manage, which really is so that make sure that we could actually turn around the 55-day security, no longer than an hour. So it's 50,000 transaction is what we are planning for, but as we start as a transition period, it is going to be less than that. So I think I'm going to make up a number, 10,000 transactions per day for, let's say, several weeks leading up to it. Do you have any concerns with that?
No, we don't have concerns with that that sort of set of numbers. What we're trying to figure out really as an industry, but also at our firm, is how quickly will clients look to convert? Will there be a very large, initial en masse of clients looking to convert, or is it going to be more graduated in terms of each client coming up with the independent decision, working through its workflow, and then making a series of decisions as to when they want to execute. And that means that by definition, it'll be more staggered. We're still trying to come up with that answer. Obviously, our clients will tell us. Eventually, they'll tell us.
Well,
You know,
we
pretty
have
soon.
we have a polling question. So why don't we queue up the second polling question? Brian?
Sure. Polling question number 3. When would you want to begin exchanging? Option 1, immediately upon opening of the exchange. Option 2, 3 to 6 months of opening an exchange. Option 3, more than 6 months after the exchange opens. 4, only prior to selling them. 5, I don't know yet. 6, I do not plan to exchange.
All right. What would it be?
Okay, it looks like quite a distribution. So the biggest is option 2, 3 to 6 months opening exchange at 29%, followed by 5, I don't know yet, that's 24.5%. 1 is the third best, immediately, 20%, which is 21% of the volume, and 14%, approximately 14% said, I'm not planning to exchange at all.
Okay. Not surprising.
No.
All right. Okay. Okay. So the other thing I do wanted to announce is with our exchange program, we are opening up the exchange in early May. So both the Tradeweb path and the dealer facilitated path will be open on May 7th. First settle, like I talked about, is May 17th. But what we're going to try to do is we're going to do some test wheel production exchange with our retain, and that's really just to help out with the overall ecosystem, including index providers, the data analytics providers, and custodians across the board to make sure that the actual transaction could happen. And we're planning that end of March. So you will see actual real transactions. So hopefully that will go well and help the overall market. Okay? So I'm going to give you guys final chance. Any other comments that you guys want?
I think I'd say, and I'd just encourage investors that are looking to exchanges to, especially with the first few exchanges, like plan to have a fair amount of time, turnaround time. They're not trades. We're not, we're not subject to, to market volatility within exchanges because they're paired transactions. So. I would urge people to plan, over communicate with the first few exchanges. As the industry figures out, kind of, in practice, the flow of information and not just between investor and dealer, but investor, dealer, Freddie, custodian, and say be patient with respect to turnaround times in scheduling the exchange. In leveling the trades, just because I think we're very conscious of getting it right, the first time.
Okay, great. So I'm going to go ahead and open up for questions out to the audience. Usually when we do the webinars, I get tons of questions around exchange. So I know that we have some mic runners.
Barbara, if I could just add one more point.
No, go ahead, Chris.
In addition to what's already been said, again, a reminder, initiate the actual request for the exchange as early as possible. Get those instructions to the custodian with the SWIFT requirements in place. But we've also had some medium and small investment managers say to us they're not going to be ready with the SWIFT changes. So that being said, we've also created an alternate path through our JP Morgan Markets, our transaction initiation tool, where clients can add those details into special instructions. So I would say for clients using other providers, check with them to see if there's any alternate path, because for us, for example, we're not going to take those instructions via fax.
Got it. Okay, yeah. So I think that's very, very valid point. So please work with the other custodians because they might have different approaches of handling this. Okay, so with that, let me open it up to any questions. No questions?
One on the back.
One in the back? I can't see anything, so I believe you.
Afternoon. This question's for Iran. If I was going to go through a dealer facilitated path, how would I indicate in my Swift message that this was an exchange for the custodian?
So for the dealer path, the way we approach this, and I've talked to Frank and Greg here as well as other broker dealers, essentially you'd indicate your interest to exchange by providing them with QSIP, par amount, trade date, as well as to the degree that you can, the portfolio, some sort of portfolio indicator, whether it's a portfolio name or number. I think they may be willing to work with you on that. The idea here is that you indicate that interest to exchange to the broker-dealer, and then what would happen at that point, and Frank and Greg, feel free to jump in here, they would execute the exchanges on your behalf with Freddie, and then come back to you confirming that the trades have been executed. And then we as BlackRock, at least, will have our trader upload this trade in Aladdin with what we call, and Dylan, you might be familiar with this, with a BLT file, thus reflecting the trade in Aladdin as well. The key component here is that exchange ID. So when you send in the indications to the broker-dealers, obviously, as I said, you're including the pool number, QSIP, the par amount, settlement dates, and so forth. The exchange ID, you'll get it back only once the broker-dealer has executed that trade with Freddie Mac. So the trader, the PM, or whoever is inputting these trades in the system, in Aladdin in this case, would have to manually input that exchange ID for each transaction line.
Okay.
And Greg and Frank, I don't know if you
Yeah, I think we're planning on giving back our client the actual exchange file that we receive when we schedule the exchange with Freddie Mac, which will have the exchange ID, or I think what we're calling a deal ID, and then another unique identifier for the individual piece of collateral that's being exchanged.
Yeah. The only thing I would add is it's the critical piece of information actually is coming from the client's systems, not the broker dealers. So we're not instructing your custodian bank. It's effectively your internal transaction must be modified to understand that this is an exchange, not a regular transaction.
And obviously, one last piece of information there is, for the dealer path, as you know, for the direct to Freddie path, you're not required to include the UMBS piece on the 22C tag in the SWIFT. However, for the dealer path, we are required to. So we as BlackRock, and as well as our Aladdin clients, will be sending out to the custodians, both the exchange ID as well as the UMBS identifier, so that the custodians can easily differentiate between the market trades versus the exchange trades.
That's right. Okay. Any other questions? I think I see a couple of hands in the back.
Question for Barbara. Freddie Mac is going to have several exchange activity reports. Will there be a way to see how much of each pool has been exchanged so far to date, like at the pool level?
Yes. Yeah, so of course we haven't opened up exchanges, so you're not going to see anything yet. But starting really end of March, let's say our retained started to exchange some of the 45 to 55, you'll start to see the daily exchange reports, disclosures going out. Okay? I think the cumulative is out there now, but you just will see that it's all 45 days so far, no activities in 55.
Hi, this is for Barbara also. What is to hold up dealers from booking an exchange 2 months out and then deciding they don't want to actually do it, but kind of locking in their spot? Could that kind of cause a problem for you? Would there be a penalty? When could we cancel an exchange that was booked forward? And I don't know if you could answer this, but is everybody putting the trades on their book the day that they say that they're intending on executing an exchange? Because I know something like with the Giant, we can say we're going to do it, and then we can change our size, we could change our settlement date, or we could just sell out spec bonds and cancel a Giant altogether.
Okay, so there are two parts. So let me address the first part. So the first part around just hoarding the capacity for the calendars, I think it's definitely a concern that we do have. So there are 33, of course, dealers that we're working with, and they're awesome. I know that they're not going to, play games with that. But what we are going to do is we're going to monitor sort of, trades that's been booked and canceled. There is no fee associated with canceling these trades. Yeah, so they could, try to hoard the capacity, and there are 50,000 transactions that we could actually handle per day. So we will manage that. And then, now that we have also opened up to the investor community, that's another metrics that we will look at to manage. But just far as the capacity concern, I want to maybe just talk about that a bit. So there are 70,000 securities that is eligible for exchange, as of today, about 70,000. We don't know how many pieces it comes in. So if they are, multiple sub-accounts, that one CUSIP could be broken into 50 sort of pieces, and it could be, traded, many times. But we did get some data from the Fed and also from the top custodians. And so on average, it looks like, maybe a CUSIP could be spread against 3 custodians, and then within the custodian, it looks like it's about 3 sub-accounts on average. So we're looking at, so just a roundabout, it's about 700,000 transactions that could potentially come through. But if I look at the 70,000 actual securities and calculated the float comp associated with that, there are about 40,000 securities that gets paid less than $1,000 from a float comp perspective. So are you really going to go through, if you have, $10 of float comp that you're going to get for hold security, are you going to go through an exchange? Probably not. So from a capacity perspective, I am concerned, but I'm not sure that concerned, because we will manage that. The second question around, actually booking in the day that we put the trade in, I'm not sure. I'm going to, turn it over to Greg and from our perspective, it's confirmed, right? So that, we're expecting that to be there, because you could book this month and then next month, but we are expecting that to be there, but you could also always cancel.
Yeah, I'd say, you touched upon a good point, Barbara, that there are very small pieces that economically don't make sense to exchange. Your clearance fees alone, may make that, commercially unviable. In terms of hoarding capacity, I think, as a dealer, we, based on what we're going to exchange, I don't think that that's going to be a large driver of capacity consumption. But, outside of that, we're essentially, at the mercy of our clients. So, I would hope that, nobody would hoard capacity, but I think from a, if we do see patterns of behavior, or, ourselves as dealers facilitating exchanges for clients, then, if we do see what we perceive as, as bad behavior for clients, we certainly don't want to be in a position where we're, facilitating any sort of client misconduct. So we would look at that and address it appropriately, and that may be, declining to do exchanges, or having conversations about what expectations we have with living up to exchanges. I think the second part of the question with respect to are there any essentially are there any downside to scheduling exchanges 2 months out? I think the obvious one, right, is that we would go over a factor date, and that changes the economics of the trade. So if people can wait up to or within the same factor period, that's, I think, preferable, so that you're not in a situation where you've got to amend, if you are recording the trades on your books, the conversion trades on your books, on the day you do the reservation, that you don't then have to go back and amend the economics of the trades themselves vis-a-vis factors, and or to the extent that the float comp changes.
Okay, great. Any other questions? Okay, I think we're done. Thank you very much.